Hello and welcome to this tutorial, an introduction to video editing using the Blender VSE. This is an update to a video that I'd released back in 2013 and had since gotten almost 370,000 views. I'm hoping to address a lot of the issues some people had back then, as well as provide an up-to-date version of this technique. Now I'll be covering everything from setting up your projects to transitions, using meta strips, and even exporting your final video. So this is an all-round start to finish tutorial which should get you on your way. This video might require only one add-on, and that is a Python script which remaps your keys to a set of Final Cut Pro 7 shortcuts. Now, as a bonus, I've also supplied a script that makes the keys to Premiere shortcuts as well. And I'll show you how to import them into Blender and apply them in the video ahead. So speaking of which, why don't we get started? So the first and most important part of any editing project, regardless of the software that you're using, is your job folder. Now, I've got a little folder here called Projects, and I'm going to take you through my particular system of setting up a job folder. I'm obviously on a Mac, but this works for Linux and Windows too. First thing I'm going to do is make a new folder, and I'm just going to call this my video project. Now inside that, let's see if I move this out to a little bit wider. There we go. The first folder is going to be an assets folder. Okay, now I've done this in column view for my Mac, so if you guys are on other systems, you might be able to get into column view. I generally find this easy so you can actually see the hierarchy. So you can see that there's my video project, and inside that is assets. I'm going to put another folder in there, and this is going to be called projects. And a third folder, renders. This is generally how I set it up. Now going back to assets, in general, the assets that you're going to use for any edit are going to be the following. So inside assets, I'm going to make a new folder. I'm going to call this video, because that's going to be footage assets. The other one that you're going to use is audio. That's for any sound files. And I like to make one more called stills, and this is for anything that's like an overlay or a still that you're going to do panning or zooming or some Ken Burns thing. Now you can further break that down, if you want to do audio in terms of, file types or anything like that, go right ahead, but this is generally where I leave it. The other folder that I like to add a subfolder to is renders. Now, this is sort of an older system of doing it. I kind of go with a high res and a low res. Your high res, low res basically means that this is your archival material, the stuff that you're going to keep that's always high res. And this is going to be, your big files. And your low res will be stuff that you may want to share with collaborators, or you might want to put on Dropbox or email someone, if that's still a thing. And you don't want to spend bandwidth uploading gigabytes of stuff. So just a quick overview. You've got your My Video project, which you label whatever it is, assets folder, projects and renders. Inside your assets folder, you've got audio, stills and video. Inside your renders folder, you've got a high res and low res folder. So here I have Premiere open, and this is sort of what I do my video editing in. And I'm just opening this to illustrate the anatomy of a good nonlinear editing program. So what makes an NLE sort of function? Well, we've got a couple of essential windows. This is known as your bin. A bin is basically where all of your media lives, so that you've got easy access to audio files or stills. Now bins can function in one of two ways. One is that you create it inside the program, and the other way is that you can actually navigate to a folder structure, in this case the folder structure that we've set up, and that acts essentially as your bin. So what else do we have? We've got a preview window. This is where your media shows up. So, say if I was scrubbing along, you can actually see the media as you're scrubbing along a timeline. Now, speaking of timeline, this is a very important area. This is the timeline. This is basically where all your media it comes down to be edited together, and your timeline basically functions from, a 0 point to however long your project is. Now, there's also this sort of miscellaneous window, which sometimes can be a source clip window. So, say, for instance, I was going to take a piece of media and just preview it. Sometimes that's usually a good function. Now, this is one that is going to be sort of hard to replicate in Blender the way we want to do it, like here in Premiere. And I often find this useful because this is a way that we can pre-edit something by setting in and out points and then dragging it down to the timeline. In Blender, it doesn't exactly work that way, so I'm just going to tell you that right now. But the other panel that does sort of make a lot of sense is some sort of an effects control. And this is where you've got, do you need to reposition your clip or scale it or do other things like change its opacity or blend mode for whatever kind of editing you wish to do. And usually having an effects panel is a good idea. So turning Blender into a video editing or an NLE application is basically the first step to editing in Blender. Now, I've opened up the latest download of Blender, and here is your default layout, which is perfect for 3D animation and modeling and whatnot, but not so great for video editing. If you go up here to where it says default, and there's this sort of little button here with a bunch of panels, this is actually your screen layout defaults. If you click on that, you'll actually see that video editing is one of the layouts that is preloaded in Blender. So we're going to go ahead and click on that. And this is what we get. Now let me explain what these windows are. This window here is your video sequence editor, but it is set to image preview. And so this is sort of like, if we just switch back to Premiere for a second, sort of like your preview window over here. Okay, so that makes sense. We've also got this, which is the sequencer, which acts as our timeline. We've also got this down here, which is also a timeline, and it's got a few things, but they're very sort of hard to see down here. And to be honest, the only function that this serves is to have sort of a playhead, like a play, pause, step back, step forward in screens, that sort of stuff. Because we'll be generally using shortcut keys to do all of that, that's probably the first window I would close down. There's this window, which is the graph editor. This serves one purpose, but we want it to serve another purpose, and it's quite easy to kind of edit this window layout. So the first thing I'm going to do, of course, as I said, is going to collapse these two windows so we only have our timeline down here. Now, Blender's got these little handles that if you sort of mouse over to the top right hand corner and you sort of drag into the real estate of the other window, you get this arrow. And before you click, you should drag it the other way and collapse it that way. And so now this has become our timeline. We're going to keep this preview window. Just as a note, you'll see that this timeline or sequencer is called Video Sequence Editor, and this is called Video Sequence Editor. They are essentially the same window, and here's what's different about them. You can actually set this window to 3 different types. One is Sequencer, which is what this is set at. One is Image Preview, which is what this is set at. And the other one is a combination of the two. And sometimes it's a good idea to sort of save on real estate. You want this sort of sequencer and video to show up. But for our purposes, setting one window to the sequencer and the other one to video preview kind of works in our favor. Now this window over here, which is the graph editor, we're going to turn this into our bin. And the way we do that is to go down here to where it says graph editor, and we're going to show up our file browser. What we can do with our file browser is navigate to projects over here, my video project, and you'll see all of a sudden that all of our assets, projects and renders show up. Now this particular window we can collapse if you don't like it, but this actually gives us a bit of a hierarchy. And so we could populate, if you sort of drag this divider down, you can actually populate this with a few other useful windows if you wanted to, you can add a bookmark to that and say, let's say we went to my video project, add that bookmark to my video project, right? You could sort of have that, and so we just collapse the system bookmarks and just sort of have our bookmark page there. So if you've got more than one project going, you can switch between them, and any time you go there, it'll show up the assets folders for that particular project. Now in this window there are a few things, and you see that they sort of disappear off the edge here because you've got a few extra buttons here. Now we don't sort of need all of those, but one that comes in very, very handy next to the word none here is our display modes, and its current default is short list. You can also change it to another list, which pretty much is exactly the same, but the one that I find the most useful is thumbnails. Okay, now once we begin to populate the assets folder, so say we go assets, and then let's say we had videos. Once we begin to populate this with assets such as stills and videos, these thumbnails become visible, and then they're very easy to drag and drop onto a sequencer or into the preview window or what have you. You can also go ahead and add more folders to this, and that will actually be reflected in your folder structure. Now we've got this sort of gray area here, which is actually our properties pane, and that'll allow you to do certain things to the media that you place on the timeline. So as soon as we begin to populate this with media, you'll sort of see how that works. So now all we need is a little bit of media, and I've gone ahead and produced some video and stills for you for this demonstration. I'm going to switch my display mode from list over to thumbnail so you can sort of see a little bit better. Now you can actually change the size of the thumbnail, so if they're really, really tiny for some reason like this, you can just come over to the right of the thumbnail icon, and you can get large, normal, small. I tend to like normal because I can sort of see everything in a reasonable size of a window. And to just sort of maximize this, I'm going to flick this over like that. And so to show you what I've done, I'm going to click on video. I've got a couple of variations on one intro blurb that I shot on my phone. This is a 1920 by 1080 HD bit of video compressed at H.264, and I've done one with two different audio codecs just in case one doesn't work, and I'll take you through some workarounds because some of the comments from the previous video had to do with audio, so I'm going to try to cover a few of those bases to help you out just in case you run into some difficulty. I've tested both of these, they both work just fine, but then again they're short. It's generally when you get into longer clips that you run into some trouble. I've also got an intro board and an outro board. In stills, I've gone ahead and rendered out a PNG sequences for a turnaround of this this nice looking toon shaded cliff face, and I've got a couple of passes here. I've got an AO pass and a fully rendered pass, and finally I've got a piece of audio here from I've got to give credit to this. It's royalty free. I got it off SoundCloud. And credit goes to Argo Fox. I'll link this page in the notes on the YouTube video so you can go and check it out if you really, really like it. So why don't we go ahead and start adding some clips. So I'm going to grab this, the intro board plane, and I'm going to drag it down to my sequence editor, and I'm going to put it on channel 1. Now, there's a bunch of channels here, 0 up to, I don't know how far it goes. I think it could be infinite. But you can drag and drop that onto any channel you like. These are basically like your video or audio strips. The sequence doesn't discriminate between an audio or a video strip. They all kind of get bundled in together. One thing that happens though, however, is the strip snaps to wherever this playhead is. So for example, if I move my playhead, I've got to right click on the playhead and I've got to drag it over. Come on. Yeah, drag it over. And I bring my playhead over here and I grab, say, this outro, right? And I try to drag it over here. It automatically snaps to where the playhead is. But that's not a problem because dragging your clips without modifying anything in Blender is pretty much like Premiere or Final Cut, and that is that you can click and you can drag. And when you do that, it actually shows you a couple of things. So let's zoom in here. I'm going to hit my plus on my keyboard, and I'm just going to scroll over a little bit so we can see. Maybe I'm just going to zoom in a little bit wider. I'm just using my trackpad here. So if I grab this just by clicking and dragging, you can see that it tells me what frame I am snapping to here and where the last frame of the previous clip is. Now, if I go over that previous clip, you'll see that you get this nice little red border, and letting go or clicking doesn't allow you to override any of those frames. Okay, so it's a bit of a safety feature here. But what you can do is drag up and then overlay on top. Now, just like in Final Cut or Premiere, if you scrub along over here, whatever layer is above gets seen first, is given priority, as it were. Okay, so I'm just going to grab that playhead, right click and drag, just to show you how that works. Okay, now each of these clips also have these handles, so I can grab this handle and move it across a little bit. Now you'll notice that there's this little blue strip here. So if I zoom right up so you can see this, this strip here is basically showing you frames that have been trimmed off the clip. So if I was to say drag this all the way over here, you'll see that I can play and then there's nothing. Okay, but what this means is that I can grab that handle and retrieve that lost information, as it were. But I can do more than that. I can continue to drag this out. Now, to illustrate this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this top one. Okay, I can drag this from either side, and what that actually gives me, this is pretty neat on Blender's part, is almost like a freeze frame. So whatever the edge of that clip is, that frame is then repeated for as long as you drag that out, which is really good if you want to put in a transition before something plays through or something like that. And we'll get to transitions in a moment. And I'm going to show you what happens when I drag down some footage with some audio. See, these ones are just footage, and that's why there was no audio strip. So I'm going to go Shift, left arrow to bring my playhead back to the first frame. I'm going to grab this intro blurb 48K AAC audio codec, and I'm going to bring that down, and automatically you'll notice that it kind of gets things a little bit backwards. Well, backwards in terms of, say, video editing as we kind of know it. It generally puts the audio strip above the video strip. Now, we can always just fix this. We can just grab that video strip and just drag it up if you really want to, or we can shift select and then move, or, you know, drag that down, you know, to the right frame. And, you know, if you're sort of like really pedantic about where everything has to go. So let's just do this for now. And I'm going to play using the Blender default, which is Option A. So here is an example of a 3D model that I've taken through the Blender compositor. And you can hear the audio playing. So that's what video with audio looks like. I'm going to delete that again. Audio obviously comes in very much like video. Again, it came to the playhead and I can see an audio waveform. So if I hit Alt-A, let's just turn that down, you can sort of hear it playing. So there's going to be some funky music under our edit here. Finally, stills. I'm going to go to wireframe. Now, there's a problem with importing stills that it won't automatically import a number of stills from the bin. So if I was to say select all and then drag them down, you actually only get the first frame or the frame that you'd selected, right, dragged onto the timeline. And this is a bit of a problem, which I don't like. So how do you do it? If I go back to my playhead here, I go Shift-A to add, and I go to image or image sequence. And when I do that, it brings in that file window, and I'm going to navigate to wireframe, where here I can select all, and I hit return, and then the video plays through. So let's just play that again. You can see that it plays all of the sequence. Okay, so I'm going to do that again for another sequence. I'm going to go Shift-A, image. I'm going to navigate up to my ambient occlusion pass. I'm going to hit A to hit all and return or enter. And it brings in another clip. And if I hit Alt or Option A, it will play through that clip. So from here on in, we're now going to do something which kind of breaks Blender a little bit, but to our advantage as video editors. And that is, I'm going to be importing and using a Python script which reallocates a bunch of popular keystrokes that I've remapped to emulate something like Final Cut Pro. Now, to give you an idea of what is going to happen here, I'm just going to open up this image here, which is the keyboard layout of a Final Cut Pro 7. I'm expecting that people are coming to this video with some knowledge of video editing software such as Premiere or Final Cut, and there are some shortcut keys such as play stop on the spacebar, for instance, that make a lot of sense from that point of view. And so to try to remap your brain to hit Alt A all the time doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, it's perfectly fine to use all the Blender shortcut keys. There's actually some shortcut keys that I'm actually going to be leaving alone, but all the popular ones I'm actually going to remap, and I'm going to show you which ones they are in particular. So obviously, the spacebar. Another one is the razor tool. Final Cut Pro calls its razor tool the blade tool, so the shortcut key is B. JKL, they're your shuttling tools. So J is shuttle backwards, K is stop, and L is shuttle forwards. So if you're coming from Premiere or Final Cut, these ones are universal to both, as is the space bar. The only one that's a little bit different in Premiere is that the razor tool is mapped to C. But there is one key that I really like in Final Cut, and that is the zoom tool with shift on it. And this actually zooms to your entire sequence. And that's pretty cool. Now, there's one other mapping that I sort of had to go about, and I was sort of deliberating whether or not to do it, and that was on your up, down, left, and right arrows. Okay, so left and right will step forward and backwards along your timeline. Up and down, let's go shift up and shift down, will actually go up in increments of 10 frames, but hitting up or down will actually go between to the head of each clip. And so if you've done an edit and you just want to go to the next edit along, you can just hit the up arrow a few times and it will go to the next edit point. And that's extremely useful when I'm editing. There's a few that we can't remap for reasons that will become obvious. Obviously, the hand tool doesn't map very well either. And the selection tool, I kind of like to leave on the G because it's not really necessary because you just mouse select. And so it doesn't really need a key as such. So I've gone ahead and created a zip file which you can download. Just look to the link in the notes just under this video and you can download this zip file. And inside I've created some keyboard shortcuts. You can see that there's an FCP keyboard layout Python. I've also added, even though it's not too different, but you know, if you're lazy and you prefer Premiere, there's a Premiere keyboard layout which remaps keys to something more akin to Premiere. Now, to sort of show you how that works over here, I'm just going to switch over to the Premiere defaults, and you can see that there's a lot more mapped. Now, they're not all there. The similar ones, of course, are things like spacebar, okay, and JKL, left, right, up, down, do the same things. Unfortunately, Premiere doesn't really seem to have like a shift zoom like Final Cut that gives you the entire area. So I've sort of snuck that in there. So if you want to go and use Shift S, that will work in my key remapping. The other one, of course, is that the slip tool is mapped to Y. And so there's just a couple of very subtle variations in keyframes. But if you're coming from Premiere, as I said, you'll probably appreciate this Python script a little bit more. So how do we apply them? Well, it's really, really easy. Once you unzip the file, go up to File, User Preferences, and go over to Input. And what we're going to see here is that we've got this window up here. It says Blender, right? These are your preset key maps. So if we went down to say sequence global, let's take a look at a couple of them. We've got cut strips, K, Shift K, which works quite nicely. What's another one that we talked about just a second ago? View all, home, jump to strip, page up, page down, or alt page up, page down. Now, the sequencer global settings and the frame settings are basically the ones that we're looking at the most. And so frame has got a few of them, like, play animation, alt A, right? Or cancel animation, escape. And it works inside of Blender. And as I said, those shortcut keys are perfectly fine if you want to, if you're coming from a Blender perspective, you probably don't need to do this. But the rest of the tutorial is going to be talking in terms of applying this Final Cut key map. So all I do is come down here to where it says Import Key Configuration. And I navigate to where I've got my Final Cut keyboard, and I go Enter, and the layout loads automatically. So now you can see that it's got Blender Default, 3ds Max, Maya, FCP, keyboard layout. So if I now go through and take a look at some of my shortcut keys, cut strips, there's B for blade. What else have we got here? We've got trim strips, which is our slide tool. That's set to S. And under frames, if we take a look here, we've got play animation L and J. If I take a look at the play animation keystrokes in J, you can see that play reverse in this little Python window is enable. And then cancel animation, this is one that I've added in, and that basically does what the escape does, and that is it stops it. So now why don't we start creating our edit. I'm going to go navigate to my video screen. I'm going to make sure that my playhead is set here to first frame. I want to see my timeline in seconds, and so what I'm going to do is under view, make sure that show seconds is ticked. So that will work nicely. So as I move, you can see that the playhead actually has, let's hit the space bar and see if that works. That works just fine. Or even L and stop with K. And you can see that you get this seconds and frame counter. And just to make sure that I've got it set to the PAL system, which is where I'm working, I'm going to come up here to where it says File Browser. I'm going to go down to Properties, and I'm going to set up my sequence settings. This is very similar to what you do in Final Cut or Premiere. The first thing I want to look at is my resolution, and this is set to 1920 by 1080, and I've got to set all the way to 100. That's fine. My frame rate is 25. Now, a note for anyone using it in a different system, such as North America, you might want to set yours to 29.97 or even 30 frames because you're on an NTSC system, but I am on a PAL system and all my videos sort of compress to that, so I'm going to be using 25. Now, if you want to see some of these panels right up against each other, so you've got no need for, say, sampled motion blur or any of the shading settings, you can actually grab these little handles here right on the right hand side and drag that up. So just the relevant panels are shown. So we've got render presets, I've got that 1920 by 1080 there, and then I've got my output, which in my case I've gone for QuickTime. However, you can do whatever you wish, H.264, AVI. The video codec shows up depending on what you choose. So if I was to say go to AVI RAW, you get a completely different panel there as opposed to, say, QuickTime, where I'm going to go with H.264 because this is sort of a compression that it's not, uncompressed. Like if I wanted to go to broadcast, say, I'd go uncompressed 8-bit or even 10-bit. But it works great for my purposes, and it compresses out a nice video that can go up to YouTube, let's say. I'm going to leave it on RGB. I've got no real reason to use an alpha channel at the moment. So all my backgrounds are going to be this black. It's not going to be like the checkerboard or whatever. Video quality, I want it to be 100%. Now audio codec, because it's QuickTime and because it's what I'm working with, I'm going to leave that at AAC. However, if you have any problems with this, LPCM is a good standby. I'm going to go with 48 kilohertz because all of my audio that I'm importing is at 48. And so if you start messing up the audio codecs, that's where sometimes you get timing issues with audio strips, so I'm going to leave that at 48. A bitrate 256 is good enough. If you want to create a smaller clip, you can bump that down to say 192. I wouldn't go below 128. This does make for a slightly smaller file, but keep in mind that the audio component of any video is almost negligible compared to the video content, okay? So bumping it down will only sort of shave megabytes off a very large file that's in the gigs. So I'm going to leave this at 256 because I want good quality audio, and I'm going to leave this at VBR and HQ. I don't really need to look at anything else, but post-processing might be the next one that I need just to make sure the sequence is on. And if, say, Fields is enabled, you don't need this enabled, okay? This is an old system. Everything is kind of progressive now, which means single full frames. So Fields, if it's ticked, you might get some strobing issues on your render. And so if that happens, just untick Fields. And I certainly don't need any of the edge detection. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go down to my left-hand corner and I'm going to drag this out. So this becomes my middle screen. I'm going to file browser here. Make this my little middle screen here. Okay. I need to show you this. Okay, so this could be sort of like our little properties panel. I'm just going to switch over to Premiere over here. You know how here we've got little effects controls. So if I click on something like that, we can use this middle panel in Blender sort of like that. I'm going to go Shift back arrow to go to my first frame, and I'm going to drag down a clip. This automatically loads at this resolution. If I was to change this resolution, so let's just go for a square, right? I was going to 1920, okay? The final product is going to render out as a square, and everything stretches. But I'm definitely wanting to go just 1080p, which is what this file is. And so I'm going to leave it at that. But if you were to bring in something that was slightly distorted, there are ways that you can fix that. And that is by selecting the strip. If this panel here isn't enabled, just hit your N key, right? And this is your properties panel over here. And we can take a look at some of the properties here. And that would be image offset. I can actually offset that image by dragging X or Y. So if you've got a nice big still, you know, a nice big square still that you want to do a bit of a pan across, you can just click image offset and drag it backwards and forwards. It may still be distorted, so then what you've got to do is go image crop, and then you would have to crop down the image to make it fit into that screen. And so those are the first two places where you can actually change the content in a strip. Now, one thing that I like to have when I am creating an edit is some safe areas. What are safe areas? Well, the rule was always that the action safe is the widest one. Any action beyond that will generally be cut off. And then your title safe is where any titles should sit to sort of read comfortably on the screen. Now, the defaults aren't set to what I'm used to. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually change this. Under action safe margins, it works on a 0 to 1 sliding scale. And so 0.1 is actually 10%. Action safe should actually be 0.05, 0.05, and the title safe should be 0.1 and 0.1. There we go. So your action safe is actually 5% in from the outside border, and your title safe is 10% in from your outside border. And that's generally a good guideline to have. And like I said, you can always toggle these on and off, but if you're bringing in any stills or assets with an alpha channel on them and you want to sort of drag and position them, these guides are really good to have. This is probably the only time you're going to need this particular panel, so I'm going to hide this again by hitting N. Okay, and I'm going to go View, Fit to Preview window so we can see our entire animation as it plays through. Thanks for watching. Did you enjoy this tutorial? You can now support me on Patreon. Just $1 a month ensures that I can keep putting quality content like this right here on YouTube. But for a couple of bucks extra, you can gain access to exclusive videos that will teach you how to model, shade, and render comic and animation ready assets and backgrounds for your own personal projects. I've also released a modular set library, which will be updated with new set pieces each and every month. So what are you waiting for? Go check it out.